Hi, and welcome to episode 7 on our Anatomy of a Digitally Transformed Organization, this time on Identity and Access Management. As I said, each of these detailed videos, if you haven't done so already, please have a look at the overview video, part 1 first, to give you the context of all of this. A little bit of that. So what we're talking about here is a horizontally layered architecture, which is critical to a digitally transformed organization as opposed to a vertically layered architecture. And in this particular case, we're focusing in on the identity and access management layer of the solution. Identity and access management, that's basically who has access to our services, to our systems, and who are they. So identity part, who are they? Access, what do they get allowed to actually do? So the identity and access management layer, there's some absolute critical success factors for a digital transformed organization. First is that your security must be abstracted from the solutions and from your processes. If you've got a different security solution with a different user ID and password in all your different solutions, first of all, your user experience, both for internal staff and external users and customers, will be terrible. I'll have to remember a whole pile of different user IDs and passwords. But also there's a security risk associated with having that sort of plethora of identities, and people are then more inclined than otherwise to write down their passwords and all of those sort of no-nos. However, if you've extracted security from your solutions, it'll be much easier for you to maintain, a much lower cost, but most importantly, you'll have a much better experience for your staff and customers with just a single identity to log on to your systems for. So let's look at a few of those critical success factors, as I focused on already. Separated from your processes and services, extracted from your solutions. It should be broker-based. That one's so important, I'm actually going to cover that as the final slide of this deck to explain in a bit more detail what we mean by broker-based identity and access management. It must cover authentication, proving that I am Glenn Smith. And that exists at two levels, both proof of identity, or POI, and evidence of identity, EOI. Because depending on whether I provided proof or just evidence of my identity will underpin the trust that's associated with that identity. And of course it covers things like digital certificates, which are more detailed solutions to this problem, which also solve the issue of non-repudiation. But because different identity providers will have different levels of trust associated with them, this entire environment needs to be underpinned by a trust framework that says, once I've gone through this level of accreditation for my identity, it's going to be provided this level of trust. Here in Australia, we have the advantage that the Digital Transformation Agency, a division of the federal government, has defined a very good 4-level trust framework and is establishing the necessary credentialing and approval process for providers who wish to provide identities within this framework. Okay, so that's what do we mean by broker-based, and why is that so important to this? Well, let's talk about it first and then talk about why it's so important. So broker-based basically means that instead of our systems talking directly to an identity provider, in which case they're hardwired, if you like, to a particular identity provider, I can only use my internal user ID and password. They go through an intermediary layer called a broker, which will then provide them the ability for it to look at numerous potential identity providers, provided they're accredited and they've got a certain level of trust associated with them. So in the government environment in Australia, for example, the South Australian government could establish an identity broker, and then it could talk both to individual South Australian identities. The government might provide identity for its citizens, but could use private identity providers like Google or Facebook, or it could go out and federate to the federal government's identity broker and therefore use the federal government logons like my GovID or other things, or potentially go out to another state's broker. And so somebody moving from Queensland to South Australia would already have an identity with the Queensland government. They could use that one to log on to the South Australian government systems. So broker-based effectively means that we're putting a new intermediary layer. A broker, the analogy of a mortgage broker or an insurance broker here is perfectly apt. That's why they've chosen the term broker. So it basically sits between your systems and the security identity providers so that you can support multiple identity providers instead of just the one. And that effectively is why we recommend it being broker-based for a digitally transformed, adaptable organization, because the world is now creating many, many more identity providers, particularly in the private sector. Google, Facebook, etc. are all looking at setting up identity providers. And to make it easier to interact with your organization, be that government or private, Your customers would surely much prefer to use something they've already gone through the process for and applied for, rather than having to go through another process with you to apply for an identity to interact with your organization. And that effectively is the future of not only a digitally transformed organization, but in a way a digitally transformed society here, digitally transformed industry. Thanks, hope that was interesting and of value to you. More in the next episode.